everyone. Thanks for coming today. My name is Morgan Romine. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the co-founder and co-director of AnyKey, a nonprofit that advocates for diversity, inclusion, and equity in competitive gaming. Today I'm going to be talking about inclusion in Scholastic esports spaces with the goal of providing some helpful guidelines and practical strategies for how to make your own esports space more inclusive for players of all kinds. Now, first thing, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I am streaming from the land of the Kumeyaay people, and I just want to thank them for stewarding this territory for generations. Now, with those respects paid, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit more. I am an anthropologist. I have been working in online gaming communities and esports communities for the better part of 2 decades. Before getting my doctorate, I worked in community management, online marketing, esports management, on the industry side for game publishers and game studio. I was also a professional competitive player during that time, and I founded an all-women's competitive team called the Frag Dolls. I've been passionate about this idea of a more inclusive future for esports for a long time, and I've been able to carry that work through and forward with what we do at AnyKey. We do research, we do education, we do initiatives, we do outreach, all for the purpose of supporting diversity, inclusion, and equity in gaming. Now, I started with that welcoming gesture of the land acknowledgement because today we're talking about inclusion, and we're talking about ways to make Scholastic esports more inclusive. Now, you've already heard me say 3 terms multiple times lumped together: diversity, inclusion, and equity. And all 3 of those are really important functions and have different meanings. So I want to make sure we clarify what I'm talking about when I talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity as actual strategies for helping to make our spaces more welcoming. To start off, diversity refers to how many different types of people are represented in the group. Diversity is a benefit to everybody. It makes teams better. It makes learning experiences more rich. But diversity cannot stand on its own. You can aim to invite in a diverse audience of people, but you can't maintain that diversity or keep those people there if you do not also prioritize inclusion. Inclusion refers to everyone in a space feeling like they can meaningfully participate. Making a space inclusive with intention is what allows diversity in a group to grow and persist. Today, I'll be focused on ideas that are based around inclusion, where we're trying to make Scholastic esports spaces that welcome and support participation by people of all kinds by doing things like protecting against discrimination, reducing toxicity, increasing representation, and teaching the positive values of teamwork. We'll obviously get in more details about these. Creating inclusive spaces also overlaps with the idea of creating equitable opportunities. Equity is another really important concept, and it's often confused with equality, so I want to cover that real quick. These awesome illustrations are brought to us by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Now, equality refers to ensuring that everyone gets exactly the same thing as everyone else, regardless of their needs or abilities. Equity, on the other hand, you can see it behind me there, means ensuring that everyone gets the thing that's best suited to their needs. Success can look lots of different ways to different people depending on who they are and what their background is, and making sure that people get things that they need to be able to succeed can look differently. And equity is about considering people's different needs and abilities when trying to help them to be successful. This is especially important in Scholastic environments. Now, all forms of gaming face challenges to inclusion. It's not just the Scholastic esports. But understandably, when the most popular forms of something like esports, the stuff that we usually see the most visible, the highest stakes forms of esports, they have these deep-rooted problems with things like toxicity. It can be really hard to establish new spaces based around esports that don't then carry over those same issues. But we really have an important opportunity to shift those cultural patterns through Scholastic esports by bringing up these gamers through systems that are more supportive, more inclusive, and then having them enter the industry and enter the upper echelons of pro esports competition, because in educational spaces, things like inclusion and equity and supporting students from all backgrounds That's something that's already built into these educational spaces. It's something that's already a priority. Accessibility and quality of student life. Those are all things that educators and administrators are trying to think about. So the question really is, how do we continue to foster those things for students through esports? Now, there are 5 critical issues I would like to flag before we start getting into talking about barriers to inclusion and some of the strategies. These are some things that we face in the Scholastic space in particular. There's interference from off-campus interests, and this can include game companies, third-party organizations, and for-profit entities that are often have the capital to shape the space and to lead how esports is developing in these spaces. But some of them can be predatory. Often they're prioritizing their profits over student needs, and that can be a thing that can undermine efforts at inclusion. There's also an over-reliance on professional esports as the model for programs, as the role model. And what we see is that inclusion is really a challenge in those pro spaces, and often that's not something that's prioritized. So when Scholastic esports spaces automatically look to those professional teams and organizations and players as role models or as ways to try to figure out how to navigate esports, we can unintentionally adopt some of those bad habits. There's also an overrepresentation of PC gaming, and this is true. This has been true for esports since before it was even called esports. Often, all of the biggest esports titles that have the biggest prize pools are being supported by PC hardware manufacturers, and no wonder that a lot of amazing gaming happens on PCs. But for the purposes of Scholastic esports and being inclusive, we have to think outside the PC gaming box, as it were. There we go. We also have seen that there is a limited scope of diversity in the conversations about inclusion in the Scholastic, well, in esports in general, but also in the Scholastic space, where often what we're talking about, or what is being talked about when we talk about diversity, when we hear about diversity, is they're talking about gender inclusion and gender diversity, but very little attention is being given to other salient domains like race, sexuality, and disability. The barriers to participation are intersectional, not just gender-based. So we have to think outside of just trying to get more girls and women involved. We have to try to figure out how to make Scholastic esports welcoming for everyone. Now, we have barriers to entry and equitable participation, where underrepresented folks in esports includes girls and women, non-binary players, people of color, LGBTQ folks, and disabled folks. And they face significant barriers to entry and equitable participation. It's not as easy as just picking up a game controller and spending a lot of hours on it and getting good. The barriers are complex and overlapping. We'll talk about them a little bit, but one of the roles of an ally is to try to understand better what these barriers are, because if you're not actively trying to knock them down, the chances are that you are accidentally keeping these barriers in place. So let's talk about what some of these barriers are so they can be more easily recognized when they pop up. One of them is lack of access to equipment and games. There's a socioeconomic barrier there. PCs, very expensive. And trying to get a high-end PC where you can play some of these games competitively can be very difficult, if not entirely impossible, for a large group of young players. So providing access to equipment and games can just by itself can be a huge help. We also see there's a lack of representation, and we like to say that if you can't see it, you can't be it. And it's real hard for the casual gamers at home to aspire to become more deeply involved in esports, let alone to aspire to play at the most top competitive levels if they don't see anybody else like them on those broadcasts, on those stages, and in those competitive tournaments. And we really see a discrepancy between who is playing on those top most elite stages and who's playing at home, because really participation on a casual level is near equal across gender and race, but there's a lack of visibility of those folks who are playing well, maybe at the amateur level, and definitely a lack of representation in the top. And it's really hard for aspirational players to come up through diverse backgrounds if they're not seeing themselves there already. We also find that those players who do persist in the space and do play and they know that they're marginalized, feel marginalized, know that maybe it's weird for girls to play games competitively, they feel isolated. It's hard for them to find friends to game with, maybe hard for them to find people who have experiences that are similar to theirs. And being able to play with others and find others to play with is really important for being able to increase your skill. So we find that women and people of color, LGBTQ folks, disabled gamers struggle to find networks where they can play regularly and practice in spaces that are safe for them and supportive for them. We see discrimination being a regular, everyday thing, very casual bigotry, for example. Comments like "that's so gay" or "you play like a girl," those types of microaggressions can make the folks who are already marginalized feel like they definitely don't belong there and maybe shouldn't be investing as much time as maybe they would like to, because if they feel like they're not the default player or they're strange for being there, it can be difficult because they can internalize that sort of negative talk, even when the players who are saying these things maybe are not thinking about them specifically, not realizing maybe that there is a girl who's hearing them say "you play like a girl." That can actually be a sort of subtle pressure that builds up over time and pushes marginalized folks even further to the margins. Now, toxicity takes many forms. Harassment is one of the biggest forms of those, and harassment itself takes many forms. This harassment and toxicity can look like verbal abuse, slurs, hate speech, all of which, if they're related to gender, identity, sexual orientation, race, disability, body type, or religion, negative comments around any of those identity features can be construed as verbal abuse and hate speech. Folks also cause disruption through spamming, raiding, and hijacking, stalking and intimidation. They dox folks. They're subjected to unwelcome sexual attention, and this culture of discrimination and harassment is something that we see negatively impacting the experiences of most people who play games, but by far the folks who are already marginalized and underrepresented experience those things 10 times worse, much more intensely. They're much more frequently targeted with that kind of negative behavior, all of which takes a serious toll on their participation. So how can we do better? We have a 12-point plan. We have 12 strategies that can be implemented by most folks, most of you who are bootstrapping your own programs or trying to make your already existing spaces more inclusive. Now that we have a sense of what some of the barriers and the challenges are, we can talk about strategies to face them. First of all, if you're working with an established space, an established esports club of any kind, it really helps to do your own diversity audit and create a plan for inclusion. And that means trying to take an honest look at what things look like in your space, who's participating, who maybe has joined and then left, who has joined and stuck around, talking to them to figure out what has, any students who are maybe at the fringes, talk to them about their experiences. If you have some folks who are underrepresented, like maybe you have, one or two girls who are part of a club that are otherwise all boys, talk to them about what their experiences are like, and if they're sticking around, why have they stuck around? What has helped them to do that? Or maybe ask them what might help them to stick around and feel better supported. And that can lay the groundwork for your plan for inclusion moving forward. You also want to set clear expectations. This can serve as a preventative measure where you are communicating clearly at the very beginning of a season or of a league or a tournament or whatever. When you're bringing a team together, you start off by setting the expectations for what kind of behavior and what kind of values you want to support in that space, and that you want everybody who's participating to support. And one of actually the best tools that we always recommend is to provide a code of conduct and enforce it. And even better than that, instead of just providing a code of conduct, work with your team at the beginning of the season to help to craft a code of conduct that makes sense to those players. You can provide, the outline of the main values that you want to support. For example, our any keystone code has compassion, integrity, respect, and courage. Those are 4 values that we think are really important. And when we work with communities and teams, we encourage them to think through what does that mean to them, and what do they think that would actually look like in their everyday gaming environment. That tends to make it stick a lot better, and it becomes something that they own instead of something that is imposed upon them. Now, you also, for the enforcement part of this, you really need to provide a clear mechanism for students to report problems or issues. You have to establish those clear procedures for handling reported violations, because you don't want to find yourself in a situation where something happens and then you're not sure who to talk to, or the students don't know how to report it. Those make problems worse, and that can be the type of thing where maybe somebody has had an experience that was negative, they don't know who to turn to, it doesn't get resolved, and so then they leave. Now, you also want to develop programs for diverse levels and different levels of skill and different forms of participation. This can take lots of different forms, but I mean, the basic idea is that varsity esports is not the only way for folks to engage with esports in a Scholastic environment. And certainly for those of you who are developing a curriculum based around esports, that is one really wonderful way to incorporate esports enthusiasts and players of all kinds in engaging with esports in an educational way. But there are other ways that you can provide opportunities for students to engage that is not necessarily dependent upon super high levels of skill or intense competition. So there are a few ways, we have a few examples of how you can do that. For one thing, you can welcome in console gamers and mobile gamers. So even if you don't have a varsity tournament to participate in, creating events around console games and mobile games can be a way to invite in and include a bunch of different types of players. You can also create events that very specifically and intentionally invite in the noobs. Invite them in, say that it's going to be a noob event. There are going to be other rookies there, and maybe it'll be something like they pair up the rookies with the veterans, and you get to play with a veteran and get some competitive experience. One of our favorite initiatives called Smash Sisters was doing that around Super Smash Brothers, and it was wildly successful because the rookies who got to play with veterans came away with a really positive experience. They learned a lot about competition, kind of got their feet wet, and wanted to come back and play more. It's really nice to also plan events in partnership with on-campus clubs that maybe are based around identity traits or identity groups, and partner up on having some gaming events. The clubs themselves do not have to be gaming related, but that's a wonderful way to build bridges with your surrounding Scholastic community. Gaming boot camps are a wonderful way to bridge that gap. So when you're dealing with barriers to inclusion and barriers to participation with these underrepresented groups, that often means that they miss out on playtime because they're feeling like they're not building experience as rapidly as their counterparts because they don't feel welcome in the space. Boot camps, which can just be short, intensive, like a weekend or just, even just a day, that can give them a little coaching, give them some scrimmage experience, give them some tips, and it can help to build some momentum towards competition and make them feel excited about the prospect of maybe trying out for a team or getting involved in an event. Think, outside just the competitors, by hosting tournament watch parties and getting the spectators involved and enthusiasts. There are a lot of people who love to play these games that maybe don't necessarily want to have to compete to be able to be involved. So if you can invite them to an event where everybody's watching something together, that can be a way to grow your community and get people involved. Encouraging co-ed play is super fun, but it's something that takes a little bit of work. But if you can get folks used to, give them a format where they sort of are forced to reach out to players that they may not have reached out to by default, you get them used to playing with one another. And it also, if you're advertising something as explicitly co-ed, and you're saying like the teams are required to have at least one or two players who are girls, women, or non-binary, that can make those players feel explicitly included, which can produce some really sort of exciting experiences and common ground that can make your space more diverse and more feeling more welcoming. All these types of events and sort of alternative paths, they all contribute to building networks of support. And again, I think I mentioned this before, but the support networks are really key for helping these underrepresented folks feel included and thrive. It really helps if you are facing discrimination or increased levels of harassment just by default in esports, even if it's outside of your Scholastic space. It can be really helpful to know that there are people in your school club who have your back, who maybe know what you're experiencing, and can support you. That can really make a huge difference in somebody sticking around. Using inclusive language and establishing non-discriminatory policies is something that you can always be working on constantly. And actually can be a huge benefit. Using, for example, gender neutral terms when gender isn't relevant, making sure that you're not accidentally calling everybody guys. I mean, this is like a little thing, but it's something that we say every day, and that can really build up and feel exclusive to those folks who don't identify as guys. And then even when gender is important, be very intentional about including, like for example at a women's event, including all women, both cis and trans women, and then also not overdoing it on the gender policing. People usually engage with those events with integrity. You can trust people when they say, when you have a policy of you are who you say you are. So if you say that you qualify and that you are eligible for this event, then we'll believe you. You also want to make sure that in all of your media, all of your broadcasts, all of the materials that you're creating, that you make sure that you have diverse representation in those and all the content that you're creating. When you're recruiting for your teams, even for your most competitive teams, think outside the box of the numbers that are provided by the game, like your kill death ratio, your rankings, your win rates. Those often dominate the recruitment process and tryout processes, but they really don't capture the full picture of what a player can contribute to a team. So instead, well, you can certainly look at those things, but in addition to that, also evaluate things like players' communication skills, their team dedication, their focus, their personal attitude, their strategic insight, their willingness to learn. All of those things can contribute to a team that works better together for everybody, and it can also end up including different kinds of folks if you look outside of just the ratios and the rankings. Make sure that moderation, if you're hosting content, if you're running streams, if you're running your own events, if you're doing any of that stuff online where there is social chatter, make sure that you invest in moderation infrastructure, because your underrepresented folks will immediately become a target, especially if there's any amount of attention there. Making sure that somebody is keeping an eye on moderation and is quickly clamping down on anything that's discriminatory, that can really make a huge difference in someone's experience. You want to provide formal training for your bystanders and allies. Some campuses in the collegiate space have resources you can take advantage of. Not so much in the K through 12 space necessarily, but there are resources online that you yourself, if you're an educator or somebody in that space, that you can use. At Any Key, we have resources that are available for being able to do very basic inclusion 101 sort of walkthroughs with students. But having those conversations can be really helpful just to raise awareness about some of the issues that people face and just to make them a little bit more aware of what the goal is, making sure everybody feels welcome, and then to start to think through like, oh, that thing that I say regularly, it didn't even occur to me that that was not very nice or that that's exclusive, but maybe I can stop saying that and that would be better. That kind of training can be very valuable. And last but not least, you want to incentivize and reward good social leadership. Instead of just focusing on the varsity players and the MVP, you want to reward those folks who are investing a lot of time into making your club better, to making your community run, to moderating your streams. Encourage those positive role models who lead by example, not only because that encourages them to do it more and encourages others to also take on that kind of responsibility, but it also tends to then end up rewarding a lot of the underrepresented people in the group, because it's often the underrepresented folks who put a lot of labor into making tournaments run well and teams run well, because they may not feel comfortable entering the competitive side of things, but want to be involved, and they invest a lot of time and effort. So you can really encourage the underrepresented folks to contribute and reward them for their effort by rewarding things other than just the competitive skill. Now, I know that was quick. We're running low on time, but I'm happy to answer some questions either right after this for a couple minutes, or on Twitter. Always happy to answer questions there, either personally or on our AnyKey Twitter. I hope this has been helpful today, and we do have more resources on anykey.org that are specifically around supporting inclusion in esports and even for Scholastic environments. So I hope those are useful for you. And thanks again for stopping by.
Thank you so much, Morgan. That was fantastic and great to see you again. It's been a while since I've chatted with you. And so I have a couple questions here for you. Let's see. So what are some common mistakes that people make when trying to be more inclusive?
Well, I think at the very least, the effort to be inclusive is a really good first step. So at the very least, if you're trying to be inclusive, that's a good step. I think one of the main things is people don't know where to look for education on the topic. And so they kind of go into it blind, which, obviously there's pitfalls there if you're not really sure what to watch out for. The other thing, and I mentioned this in the talk, is only thinking about gender as the sort of main point of inclusion, and certainly that's really important. Certainly we do not see enough girls and women and non-binary folks playing, but we really need to be thinking more broadly in terms of how we define diversity, and how we define inclusion and what we hope to see in our communities. We want to make sure that we're addressing the intersectionality of these barriers, because there's a lot more to the problems of exclusion in esports than just gender.
We have a question here that's really interesting about high schools. It says, our county recently moved from providing a free tournament structure for our schools to contracting an outside company that now sets up the tournaments. This is now a paid service. So what are your thoughts on companies that charge high schools to be part of a tournament system? How would you navigate being able to find the funds so all students can play?
Yeah, that's really tricky. I mean, the for-profit models are really can be sketchy. There are some out there that are fine, but I think if for parents and educators who are concerned, they need to try to be involved in that process if they can. Try to give feedback, do research on the platforms that are being contracted with, and also give feedback to the platforms if you have any concerns immediately about inclusion or the safety of the space, and make sure that they understand that you're watching and that that's a priority. As far as fundraising, I mean, I think that maybe looking to some of the other other high school clubs and sports on how they do fundraising on a regular basis. You know, they do bake sales. You know, I hate to say that bake sales are the answer, because they probably are not. But I mean, I think that there are at least some other models in high school that can show, you know, sort of the participation fees and other costs that go with it. They fundraise through the community to be able to support that, and hopefully that's the type of thing that will be able to be supported.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in this session. We kind of ran out of time real quick. So above the video, you're going to see a tab that says networking. Make sure that you you reach out to Morgan, or like she said, on the AnyKey Twitter. You know, we'll definitely keep those questions coming if you didn't have a chance to ask. And so stay tuned. We've got a great another session coming right up after this.